Within the universe of Death Note, there are over 15 humans who've used the notebook at some point in the timeline, and today we're about to give each one of them a rating out of 5. In case you haven't seen the anime, the Death Note is a supernatural weapon capable of killing any human by writing down their name while picturing their face in your mind. As you'd expect, the various people who've owned the notebook have used it in a ton of different ways, and what's interesting is that there are several characters in the manga who we never saw using it in the anime. Okay, so in no particular order, the first person on this list is Kira, otherwise known as Cheap Kira, and he's a person who appeared 3 years after the end of the main series. Now, as a quick overview of what he did, initially he received the Death Note from a Shinigami called Midora, who, by the way, loves bananas instead of apples, which I thought was kind of interesting. And after he received the Death Note, the first thing he started doing, he basically started killing old people. Now specifically, he was killing old people over the age of 65 who had serious illnesses or diseases, and I guess Kira was willing to give them the death that they wanted. On the internet, old people would be posting on forums, basically just putting their pictures out there and saying what their disease is and why they want to die, and Kira would fulfill that request most of the time. In fact, by the time he was done, Japan's life expectancy decreased from first place in the world all the way down to 6th place, which means Kira must have killed thousands of people. To have an impact that big that your country's life expectancy goes from first in the world to 6th, he may have even killed a similar amount of people as Light, to have as much of an impact as that. But in terms of Kira's story, eventually things got to the point where there was a debate on Sakura TV. Basically it was a group of Kira supporters versus non-Kira supporters, and at a certain moment in the debate, a bunch of young people basically started talking about how they wanted to die as well. And he did in fact kill the people who were asking for it. Because he had the Shinigami eyes, he was able to see their names and he killed them on the spot. Now, that moment is what brought about Nia, so Nia was kind of watching the whole thing and he intervened at that moment, and he basically called out Kira and basically called him a fraud. He said that Kira was a murderer and that, he was boring, and he just disrespected Kira is the point. Following being called out by Nia on live TV, Kira then stared at the wall for 3 days without saying a word, and he then started screaming and eventually wrote his own name in the Death Note after being called out by Nia. In terms of the pros and cons of this Kira, I guess in the pros section, you could say that he did kill people who wanted to die and who were suffering. So in that sense, he did do a service for certain people. And another thing that works in his favor is that Matsuda said that Kira was solving Japan's biggest problem, which was the aging population and its burden on the pension system. So in terms of economics, apparently Kira was some kind of benefit, so that's another good thing. However, moving on to the downsides of Kira, he killed people whose families asked for them to die. Now, I see a few problems with this. I mean, number one, I can very easily imagine a scenario where a family wants to get an inheritance. Family members can have ulterior motives, and so I feel like it needs to come from the person themselves. Another bad thing is that he killed the young people on Sakura TV, and the reason this is bad is because they could have maybe turned it around, maybe their life wasn't over, but Kira just kind of killed them anyway, which is very different situation from elderly people who were suffering from illnesses and who've lived a full life. Very different situation. And finally, the last thing to mention about Kira is that he couldn't handle the consequences of being called out by L. And one funny thing, I want to contrast this with Light because when Light and Nia had their face-off, Nia said to him, you're nothing but a murderer. He basically said the same thing to Light. And if you compare Light's reaction with Kira's reaction of killing himself, it is very different. So I guess one thing you could say is that Kira, he didn't have the same level of confidence as Light. And so for that reason, I'm giving him a rating of 3 out of 5. I think that's fair, but let me know in the comments down below what you think. Following this, we have A Kira, otherwise known as Minoru Tanaka, and this was the next person to have the Death Note after Kira died. At the time, Minoru was a middle school student who scored the highest in Japan's intelligence test for 3 years in a row, and unlike Light, he was specifically chosen by Ryuk to be the one to have this notebook. In case you're wondering, this is the exact same notebook that Kira had, because after his death, Midora took it back into the Shinigami realm, and when she got there, she kind of explained how she thought the whole thing was boring and how she doesn't really understand humans, so she was done with the whole thing, and she gave the notebook back to Ryuk, who then decided to take it down to the human world himself. The reason he did this is that he wanted to find an intelligent person who'd be able to feed him apples for as long as humanly possible, and also someone who'd be able to, I guess, keep him entertained as well. That's why Ryuk specifically tried to find someone who was super intelligent, and it just so happens that Minoru, like I said, was top of the intelligence test for 3 years in a row. Now, in the beginning when they first met, Ryuk does try to pressure Minoru a little bit into doing the same kind of entertaining things as Light. However, what's very clear from the beginning is that Minoru didn't want to kill anyone with the notebook. At the same time though, he did still want to make some kind of use out of it, and so he comes up with a genius plan to sell the Death Note instead. This plan is something that had never been tried in the history of the notebook, and what I thought was interesting about it is that the reason he had to do the plan the way he did, and I'll explain it in a second, but the reason he did it the way he did was because of the way that the world had changed. There were now cameras on every street, and of course on the internet everything is tracked, so Minoru didn't really have many options when it came to selling the notebook. In the end, what he did is he took advantage of Ryuk's invisibility, and he made Ryuk go to a TV station and just hold up a sign saying that the power of Kira was for sale. Now, following that, people went on Twitter and they just started putting in their bids, and I think it went to, at that time, I think it was around 1 million, but after a while, the bids did get even more serious than that when you had countries like China and America putting in, billions and billions of dollars to try and get the Death Note. Of course, I should probably mention that even though Ryuk was invisible, there are some people who were able to see him on the TV, including Nia, Matsuda, and anyone who was there during the final showdown from the main series. Nia's plan to catch Akira was to follow Ryuk's movements from the TV station, because he assumed that after Ryuk left the station he would probably go to Akira's location, which was true. However, the issue was that you can't follow a Shinigami when they're traveling underground. Underground travel obviously means that there aren't any CCTVs following him the whole time, so yeah, it was physically impossible for them to track him all the way back to Minoru's house, and therefore they didn't have a realistic way of finding him. Now, as the bids for the Death Note kept increasing, the King of the Shinigami heard about this, and for some reason or the other, he was super angry, and he made a brand new rule which says that if you sell the Death Note, you die when you receive the money, and if you buy the Death Note, you die when you receive the notebook itself. This was the first time that a new rule had actually been added to the Death Note, and what it meant was that when Minoru received the money in the end, he ended up dying on the spot. Before we get into the pros and cons of this character, there are a few facts that I wanted to mention. The first is that after his death, Ryuk described Minoru's plan as perfect, not to mention he was the first person to defeat Nia since Nia became the new L. Akira was also a master of IQ tests and quizzes, but when it came to his actual schoolwork, he scored pretty badly, but this is probably just down to laziness, like he actually didn't really care about that stuff. Anyhow, in terms of the pros and cons, I guess the first good thing is that he outsmarted Nia. Like, he found a way to not only sell the Death Note and not be caught, but he also received the money in a way where it couldn't be traced, which should have been impossible, but the way he did it was pretty good. And this brings us to the second good thing, which is that in the process of receiving his money, he also helped out a bunch of other people as well. If you haven't read this short story, essentially what happened is that Donald Trump bid $10 trillion to buy the Death Note, and Minoru accepts this, so $10 trillion, point blank, that's what he's going to receive. However, in order to kind of hide his tracks, he splits up the $10 trillion between all people who meet certain criteria. The criteria that needed to be met was that you had a Yotsuba savings account, you lived in Tokyo, and you were under the age of 60. So all those people would receive their equal share of the 10 trillion. And it was genius because by doing it this way, no one would really know who Kira was. All they'd know is that he was one of these hundreds of thousands of people, but they didn't know exactly who. According to one person, the amount was roughly $10 million per person, and so in that sense, he helped himself, sure, but he also helped a bunch of other people as well. This led to a major boost in the Japanese economy, with people buying houses and cars and all sorts of things, and this period of economic growth was referred to as the Kira bubble. Another great thing is that Minoru's plan was so perfect that in order to lose, the Shinigami King literally had to personally get involved and make a brand new rule that obviously he didn't know about. So if it wasn't for that divine intervention, Minoru's plan would have been perfect and he would have got his money and he would have forgotten everything that happened with the Death Note. So the fact that it had to be divine intervention that stopped him, I think that's a pro. Like, it shows that your plan was completely flawless. Switching over to the downsides though, Minoru was so determined to forget everything about the Death Note that he specifically told Ryuk, he said, never show up around me again for any reason. But by being so forceful in the way he said this, it's almost like he assumed that nothing could go wrong. And when you're dealing with the supernatural, there's always a chance that something might screw up. So I feel like he was a bit too forceful in the way he said to Ryuk, never show up for any reason. And because of that, that's ultimately why he died, because Ryuk was going to go back and warn him, or at least Ryuk thought about it. And then he realized, he remembered what Minoru had said and he didn't do it. So yeah, that was Akira's biggest mistake. That being said, I do still think Akira deserves a 4.5 out of 5 overall, because at the end of the day, he had a perfect plan, he outsmarted Nier and was the first person to do that, he had good intentions in that he didn't want to kill anyone, and he created a little bit of an economic boom in Japan. So overall, his impact and his plan and his goals put together, that is definitely a 4.5 out of 5. Flashing back to the pilot chapter of Death Note, this was a draft of the story that was created some time before the main series, and in it there are 3 characters who use the notebook. The first is Taro Kagami, who's the 13-year-old protagonist, the second is his classmate Miura, and the third is an unknown person who used the Death Note back in 1979. Because their stories are interconnected, we're going to rate them at the same time, but first let's do a rundown of the pilot chapter itself. Okay, so the story begins with Taro just walking along the street and he finds a Death Note on the floor, and from that moment onwards he just uses it as his own personal diary. Now the reason for this is that the Death Note is written in English, and because this is obviously in Japan, he doesn't know what the word death means, so he doesn't really think anything of it. And so when he goes home he writes down the name of 2 bullies, and the next day they end up dead. Within the span of 2 days, he then kills a total of 5 of his bullies by accident, and with 5 people dying in the same class, naturally that is suspicious, and so an investigation begins with these 2 detectives looking into it. Logically speaking, the detectives then try to make certain connections between the 5 kids who died, and one thing they realize is that all 5 kids used to bully Miura, so Miura is one of the suspects as well as the main protagonist. During the course of their investigation, the detectives also uncover a similar case from 1979 where a bunch of employees at a specific bank all died from either heart attacks or sudden deaths, and it all happened at roughly the same time. And then the final death was an employee who committed suicide. What was interesting about that final employee is that it was discovered later on that there were other people who knew him who also died in suspicious circumstances. So from our perspective as an audience, that was clearly someone who had used the Death Note decades earlier and I guess couldn't handle what they'd done. Meanwhile, when it comes to Taro, he was in a similar position in that he literally couldn't handle the fact that he killed 5 people and he's only 13 years old, so naturally it's going to have a negative effect. So to help him with this, Ryuk offers Taro the Death Eraser. The Death Eraser is a concept that thankfully never made it to the main series, but the idea behind it is that if you rub out someone's name who's written in the Death Note, then you could literally just bring them back to life. And yeah, so Taro rubs out the names of the 5 kids, and literally the next day they just show up at school. The 2 detectives then show up to question the kids and just, find out what happened. But before the kids can say anything, they all die from heart attacks again on the spot. So like the 5 kids all die in the classroom and the 2 detectives as well. Now, what was important about this scene is that Taro isn't the one who killed them. He left his Death Note at home, so it wasn't him. We know it was someone else in the classroom at that time, but we don't know who. Shortly after this, the school temporarily closes down, and around the world, violent criminals start dying from heart attacks, and the story gets so big that it makes it onto the news. We then get this scene where on TV there are a bunch of panelists talking about who's responsible for this, and one of them mentions that if they were writing a story, then they'd make it that a boy was responsible because, the first deaths happened at a school, so it makes sense that if it was a fictional story, a boy would be the one who started this whole thing. The rest of the panelists then start debating this point, and as soon as they start talking about it, most of them are just killed. And out of nowhere, Ryuk just drops the bombshell that he had dropped his other Death Note. So as we all know, Shinigami, if you're bringing a Death Note to the human world, it's expected that you should have one for yourself and one for the human. And in Ryuk's case, he dropped both notebooks, so now there's someone else out there who has the second Death Note. Taro then comes to the realization that the other user has to be Miura because number one, he was the only other person being suspected by the detectives, and number two, he fits the criteria that was being discussed on the TV. We then get this scene where Taro runs over to Miura's house and shows him the death eraser, and they then bring everyone back to life and they go to the police. When they get to the station, they then explain basically everything that happened except for one crucial detail. Taro never mentions that he had his own Death Note for himself. The only Death Note they talk about is the one that Miura has. And eventually, the police understand what happened and they burn the notebook and presumably they burn the eraser as well so that nothing like this can ever happen again. Of course, like I said, Taro kept his notebook a secret, and 7 years later we see that Ryuk is still with him, which means that I guess they must have been doing some entertaining stuff, otherwise Ryuk probably would have killed him. And somehow Death Note has become a movie and TV franchise. And we know this because as they're walking down the street, we literally see a poster for the Death Note movie up here. Not to mention there were civilians talking about how it's also a TV show as well. And then in the final page of the draft, we see that there's a Death Note manga as well. So clearly someone found out about the Death Note, maybe it was Miura or someone else, and they literally just went to town. They made it into possibly the biggest franchise in the world. I am kind of interested to know what direction this would have gone, like who is the author of this franchise and why. But yeah, in terms of their ratings, for Taro, I'm going to give him a 2.5 out of 5. Potentially it could be higher depending on what him and Ryuk got up to during that 7-year time skip. But given that we don't know anything about what they did, I'm just going to give him a 2.5 because he did make some mistakes, but he did also fix all those mistakes with the death eraser. And he also managed to trick everyone into believing that there was only one notebook, where in reality there were two, and he's the one who had the second one. When it comes to Miura, I'm giving him a 1.5 out of 5. The reason for that is that he panicked at being a suspect and killed the investigators while he was still in the classroom, like just making it super obvious. And on top of that, he killed them even though he knew he was innocent. Because remember, the whole reason why he killed them in the first place is that he thought he would be a suspect in their deaths. But it was Taro who killed them, so Miura didn't even kill them initially, but he killed them again to make sure that he wouldn't be a suspect for killing them the first time. It's just super dumb. And on top of that, he also killed the innocent panelists on live TV just because they were kind of maybe getting close to discovering that a boy was responsible, even though they never would have found him. So yeah, I just felt like sometimes he acted a bit too irrationally. The one positive is that similar to Light, he did actually have a goal, and the reason I say that is because in the manga, there was this panel here where it said that heinous criminals all over the world have been dying one after the other. So clearly Miura's, his ideology was similar to Light's in certain ways. Lastly, the unknown person who killed all his colleagues with the Death Note, he gets a 0 out of 5 because even though we don't know much about him, just from what we know, I don't see any redeeming qualities at all with that one. So yeah, the unknown person, whatever his name is, he gets a 0 out of 5. Now, switching over to the main series, the first person we have to give a rating to is of course Light Yagami, aka the original Kira. Out of every person who used the Death Note, Light by far had the biggest global impact, evidenced in the years after his death, when we learned that he reduced crime by 70% and ended wars as well. Additionally, even though nobody knew that Light was actually Kira, the fact is that his actions led to a kind of like a domino effect, where now the subject of Kira is taught in schools, his power was recognized by governments, and he has armies of religious followers waiting for him to return. In terms of how Light used the notebook, initially he started off with the intention of wanting to make the world a better place, but it didn't take very long for him to develop a massive god complex, as he was literally going around describing himself as the god of the new world. Within just 5 days of getting the Death Note, he murdered countless violent criminals around the world, technically making him a serial killer, although his justification at the time was that it was all for the benefit of society. To Light's credit, he was actually willing to die for this ideology, because when Ryuk showed up, there was that scene where Light basically said to him that he was expecting Ryuk to come and that he thought his soul was about to be taken. So that kind of shows you that he did really truly believe in what he was doing, to the extent where he was willing to give up his soul for a few days, for 5 days of just killing criminals. However, whether you agree with his ideology or not, the point where he objectively crossed the line is when he began killing innocent people who happened to get in his way. The first instance of this was when he murdered Lind L. Taylor, who was a guy that was pretending to be L. Although you could argue that Lind was a death row inmate, the fact is that Light believed that Lind was the real L, meaning that in his mind, Taylor wasn't guilty of any crimes, but still Light felt zero remorse, and by the look of it, he even got pleasure out of seeing Lind's lifeless body broadcast on the TV. What this shows us is that Light was corrupted by the Death Note almost immediately. He had poor control over his emotions and his ego, and he could be provoked into making stupid moves. This is in contrast to someone like Akira, who wasn't motivated by pride in any way and kind of executed his plan without letting his emotions get the better of him. Throughout the main series, Light then went on to kill several more innocent people for his own personal gain, including a dozen FBI agents, the head of the Japanese police, L. Watari, and not to mention, he also killed a ton of minor criminals whose crimes didn't deserve the death penalty. As the series continued, he displayed even more psychopathic traits, proving himself to be a master manipulator, ruthless, and sometimes just plain evil. What can't be denied though is that Light did study the laws of the Death Note in more detail than any other user, and he used them to his benefit in ways that only he could think of. Some of the best examples of this were the times he took advantage of the rules related to ownership and also the rules related to memory loss, and he used those to kind of engineer situations where his enemies would get wiped out and he would just seem like the perfect innocent Light that he was pretending to be. Overall, when you combine his deep understanding of the rules with his ability to predict other people's behavior, Light was able to keep his secret under wraps for 6 years and achieved his goal of a world with a lot less criminal behavior. Therefore, despite his many flaws and the fact he had a super embarrassing death, the original Kira gets a 4.5 out of 5, falling short of a perfect score due to all of the downsides that I already mentioned. Up next we have Raye Penber, who was an FBI agent and was the only person in this video besides Taro who used the Death Note to kill multiple people without even realizing it. For a bit of context about how this happened, early on into L's investigation, he realized that Kira had access to information from the Japanese police. This led to L suspecting that Kira was either part of the Japanese police or someone who was close to someone within the Japanese police, and so for that reason he sent 12 FBI agents into Japan in secret and basically asked them to do an investigation. Raye Penber was the person who was sent to follow Light, and after following him for a few days, he came to the conclusion that Light was definitely not a suspect. In fact, in episode 5, when Light speaks to Raye, he realizes that he's not under suspicion of being Kira, and that most likely Raye Penber has no clue who he really is. But regardless, he still decides to kill Raye and all of the other FBI agents as well. The reason for this is that his main target was L, as we know, and so he knew that by killing the FBI agents, it would lead to a domino effect in which L's identity would possibly be revealed to the Japanese police. The problem for Light though is that although he knew Raye Penber's name, there were still other FBI agents who he didn't know about in Japan, and so for that reason he essentially confronted Raye in a train station and forced him to write down the names of his colleagues. To be specific, Light created a situation in which Raye Penber unknowingly had pieces of the Death Note, and as Raye was writing down these names while looking at the faces of his colleagues, he was the one who was killing them without even knowing. By the time Raye was done, the 11 other investigators were dead, and this massacre led to the NPA finding out about L sending all these FBI people to investigate them and their families. When it comes to the pros and cons of Raye Penber using the Death Note, in the pros section there is literally nothing. Like, he didn't even know he was using it, and even if he did, he'd be horrified. He killed all of his colleagues and his boss, and then he died as well. So he gained literally nothing from doing this. However, when it comes to the downsides, there are a ton of them, but one of the main ones that sticks out is that when he and Light were talking, Light said to him that if Raye did everything he wanted, Light basically promised him that Ray's wife would be safe, and Ray's wife is of course Naomi Misora, and then as we found out later, Light killed her regardless. For those reasons, he gets a 0 out of 5 because there is nothing redeeming about this. It's just sad. Moving on to Misa-Misa, this is another character who you could argue was a pawn of Kira, but I guess in her case she wanted to be that, so I guess it's fine. As a quick overview, before we met Misa as a character, her parents had been killed by some, I guess just a random murderer, and for some reason that person wasn't convicted, or at the very least the trial was taking a really long time and people were starting to think that maybe he might be innocent, but then Kira swoops in and kills the killer anyway, which has led to Misa's obsession with whoever Kira is. Following that, she was then gifted a death note of her own by the Shinigami Rem, and her main goal was to find out who Kira was and just do whatever he wants. Given that she had the power of the notebook as well as the Shinigami eyes, she managed to convince everyone in society, except for L, that she was the real Kira, and the reason she pretended to be him was that she knew it would get his attention. With help from her Shinigami eyes, she was gradually able to track Light down to his address, and following that, she did whatever he wanted for years, and this included halving her lifespan for a second time, which was ridiculous. Like, who does that? Who halves their lifespan 2 times? It didn't make any sense for a normal person, but she was clearly obsessed with him to a level that I don't think even he could believe. Some quick facts about Misa is that she's the only character in the series to have 2 Shinigami fall in love with her and willing to die for her, which is an amazing achievement, to be honest. Another thing is that she's the only person to make the Shinigami ideal twice, as we already mentioned. She also had her memory of the Death Note completely erased on 2 separate occasions, and by the end of the series she has no recollection of it and no powers. In terms of the pros and cons, there are actually quite a few pros here, and the first thing I wanted to say is that when she made that plan with the tapes, it was really well thought out. Like, it was a good plan, and when she went to Aoyama to find out who Kira was, she disguised herself perfectly in a way that no one else would recognize what she looked like. So those were all good things. She was clearly intelligent to a certain extent. She also used her Shinigami eyes to Light's advantage, which is exactly what she wanted to do, and during the years in the time skip, she was the one killing criminals on Kira's behalf. There was also that scene in part 2 of the anime where she pretended to be Kira on the phone to Light's dad, and she was intimidating, she did exactly what she needed to do, so she was a useful character. When we consider that her goal was to be helpful to Light in any way possible, she definitely did fulfill that role. However, there are still quite a few drawbacks, and the first one that sticks out to me is that she was the one who gave away the existence of Shinigami. Possibly her worst mistake though was leaving physical clues on the envelopes that she sent in when she was pretending to be Kira. The main point is that the police were able to physically link Misa to the envelopes of the second Kira. And, that's why Elle never gave up on the idea that she was the second Kira and that Light was the first Kira, because there was evidence, there was physical evidence. Another bad thing is that she couldn't remember Elle's real name, even though she'd seen it. And to be fair, this is not as easy as it sounds because, she sees tons of people's names every day. But still, this was the one name that was so important. And if she had remembered it, then they could have killed him so much earlier than they did. Finally, the last downside I want to mention is that one of the main things that annoys me about Misa is that it was very obvious the whole time that Light didn't like her. There was even that one panel in the manga when he was thinking about killing her on the spot. There were just so many times that Light made it very clear he doesn't like her. And I guess she was just hoping that over time that would change, but let's be real, like, even in all that time, he did not give a crap. And partly it's because he's gay, but there's other factors at play as well. Like, he just doesn't like her as a person, I don't think. He just used her, and I guess she was happy to be used, so it's not really a negative if she's happy with it, but still. I just thought it was strange that she never got the hint after all that time. That's why overall I'm giving Misa a 3.5 out of 5. But I'm especially interested to see what you all think about this in the comments down below. Do you think she should be lower or higher? This was a difficult one to rate, so yeah, I'd appreciate your input on Misa. Following this, the next person to have the death note was Higuchi, otherwise known as the third Kira, and he's the type of person who Light specifically wanted to have the notebook. During the first half of the anime, there was a moment where Misa was captured by L and Rem kind of pressured Light into getting her released as soon as possible. And so his plan was to give the notebook to a person who has high status and lusts for power and money. He knew that that type of individual would try to use the notebook to gain even more power, and yeah, after a long search, Rem eventually found Higuchi. What's funny about Higuchi though is that although he works for Yotsuba, which is this massive conglomerate, the fact is he himself isn't very smart, and so he needed 7 other executives to help him make the decisions about who they were going to kill. Every week they all had meetings to decide which business person they were going to kill and how that killing would affect the stock of Yotsuba, and To their credit, working together, they were able to increase the stock of Yotsuba, and apparently all of their salaries increased as well. So there was definitely a benefit, but if you look at this panel here, it's clear that there are certain executives who would have been able to use the Death Note by themselves. They were smart enough to not need help. Whereas Higuchi, he wouldn't have had any success had he tried to do this by himself. And his colleagues know that, which is why they were able to work out that it was him. Some quick facts about Higuchi is that when Rem offered him the Death Note, she did so on a certain condition that he would still have to kill criminals who appear on TV. And this was to give the appearance that Kira was still active, while obviously Light and Misa were locked up. So the whole idea behind this plan was that Higuchi would do the killings of criminals, while Light and Misa were in a position where they couldn't be responsible. And so it kind of showed that they were innocent. And besides that, Higuchi was free to use the Death Note in any way he wanted. Throughout the series, Rem described him as a vile and pathetic human being and a disgusting fool, and it was implied that not only did he want to marry Misa and have a trophy wife, but there was a comment in the anime where he said that he was planning to kill her at some point, after he marries her, so that he could get some life insurance money. But it just goes to show you how much of a bad person he actually is. In terms of the pros and cons, one of the good things from their perspective is that by working with the other executives, they increase Yotsuba's stock by killing other business leaders. When it comes to the drawbacks though, there are a lot of them. One of the first ones is that he made the Shinigami ideal, but even despite doing that, he wasn't able to escape being captured and killed on the same day. So yeah, it wasn't a good day for him. Another thing is that he revealed he was Kira to Misa Amane, and essentially he was tricked by her, which is a massive L. Not to mention, he was so disliked by the other executives that they fully worked together to, participate in L's plan to take him down. In the end, Higuchi had almost no redeeming qualities as a human, and as I've said a million times, he wasn't smart enough to use the notebook by himself, which is a big minus. That is something, I can't rate you that highly if you can't use the notebook on your own. And so, for all those reasons that we've already mentioned, I'm giving him a 2 out of 5. After him, we have L, who doesn't need any introduction, but I know some of you might be wondering why he's in this video in the first place. As we saw previously with Akira, to be on this list, you don't necessarily have to kill someone with the notebook, and like we saw with Raye Penber, you also don't need to have full ownership of the notebook as well. In L's case, he falls into both of those categories in that he never killed anyone with it and he was never the official owner. However, most importantly, he had physical possession of the notebook and had the full intention of using it. Following Higuchi's death, L maintained his belief that Light and Misa were the first 2 Kiras, and he was suspicious of certain clues that Light had left behind. In order to prove that they were guilty, the first thing L had to do was to show that the 13-day rule in the notebook was fake. This 13-day rule was an idea that Light came up with, which said that a user of the notebook has to write at least one name every 13 days from the moment that they write the first name in the book. Given that Light and Misa were locked up for 50 days with no access to any notebooks, it meant that if this rule was real, they couldn't be Kira. As a consequence of this, with the exception of L, everyone else believed that these two were now completely innocent, and so in episode 25, L decided to test his theory. His plan was that the Death Note would be transported to a foreign country where a criminal on death row would write down a name. If that criminal then survived for the next 13 days, it would prove that the 13-day rule was fake, putting Light and Misa back under suspicion. The case against Misa was especially strong due to the forensic evidence, and all of the agents agreed that if they found Kira, that person would have to be executed. From Rem's perspective, this was the worst thing she could hear because by this point she was basically in love with Misa, and so to stop it from happening, she did the one thing that a Shinigami could never do, and she killed one human to extend the life of another. Knowing that L's plan would 100% lead to Misa being captured and killed, she wrote his real name in the notebook and therefore extended Misa's lifespan. In the process, Rem turned to dust given that Shinigami aren't meant to save humans, and this technically makes L one of the few people to at least indirectly kill a Shinigami. Overall, I'm giving L a 3 out of 5 given that his plan would have succeeded if not for magical factors outside of his control, because there was no way for him to know that Rem was in love with Misa. It's impossible to make that connection. And so for that reason, I'm going to be generous and give him a 3, also because he's my favorite character as well, so I just felt like being generous. Now, once Rem disappeared, it's important to note that she left behind 2 separate notebooks, one that originally belonged to her, and a separate one that belonged to a Shinigami called Sido. Sido's Death Note was the first one that dropped to Earth, and it was kept in the possession of the Japanese police following Higuchi's death. Following the time skip, it then exchanged hands at least 5 times before finally going back to its original owner Sido, who came back down to Earth to get it back. When it comes to this storyline, the version in the manga is significantly different from the version in the anime, but seeing as the manga version is more interesting, we're going to talk about that version and specifically all 5 characters who possessed or used the notebook. Those 5 people are Mello, Kal Snyder, Y462, Dwight Gordon, and Soichiro Yagami, who technically had ownership for a very short time. An interesting fact is that although it was never shown in the anime, Mello having control of this notebook directly led to the US president going offline. And to explain how, let's do a quick overview of the whole plot. Okay, so as we know, L was from a place called Wami's house, which is basically an orphanage for super gifted children, and it was clear that he was by far the smartest one out of all of them. However, when he died, they had to make a decision about who was going to be his successor, and it came down to these 2 kids, which is Mello and Nia. Between the 2 of them, they were basically on the same level, with Nia possibly being slightly smarter than Mello, but the fact is, regardless of who was cleverer, L hadn't made a final decision on which one he preferred. For that reason, Mello felt like he had something to prove to show that he should have been the one, and so he leaves Wami's house, and basically him and Nia get into this battle to see who's gonna catch Kira first. Over the next 3 years, Nia then begins his own investigation from scratch, given that all of L's data was erased, and what Nia discovers is that there is a notebook of death and it's likely in the hands of the Japanese police. Meanwhile, at the same time, Mello joins up with the Mafia in America, and he sends a spy to join Nia's investigation team. From this spy, Mello also learns about the notebook and the Japanese police, and as a result, he puts a plan into motion where they literally kidnap the director of the MPA. Mello's goal in doing this was to pressure the MPA into trading the notebook that they have for the director, but light being light, he doesn't want anyone else to have the notebook, and so he uses his own death note to kill the director. Despite that, Mello refuses to give up, and in retaliation, the next person he kidnaps is Sayu Yagami, aka the daughter of the new director of the MPA, and the sister of Kira. In a situation like this, Light isn't able to kill her in the same way he killed the director, given that that is literally his sister, and so reluctantly, he does transfer ownership of this notebook to his dad. In order to get his daughter back, his dad then hands it to one of the kidnappers with this strong desire to let it go, and according to this panel, doing that means that ownership transferred again to this random guy from the Mafia. Although we don't know this guy's real name, his code name was Y462, and after testing the notebook on 3 separate people in the manga, he eventually escapes in a helicopter. The Mafia's plan was to distract everyone by having Y462 go in this helicopter, while the real notebook was in a missile that ended up being blasted in a separate direction. Y462 then gets mercilessly blown up by the head of the Mafia, Dwight Gordon, and following this moment, the missile takes the Death Note to an unknown location. Kal Snyder was then the first person from the Mafia to pick it up, and given that Y462 was dead, touching it first made Snyder the new owner. The Mafia then used the notebook to wipe out 99% of Nia's investigation team, and this was a genius move for 2 reasons. Number 1, it slows down Nia and gives Mello the advantage in the race to catch Kira, and number 2, they killed the spy who was working for them so that Nia wouldn't be able to track them. Following all that, Mello then calls up the President of the United States and threatens to control him using the Death Note. In particular, he tells the president that if he doesn't do what he wants, he's going to write his name in the Death Note and force the president to launch a nuke, therefore beginning World War III. To stop this from happening, the only option the president is given is that number 1, the Mafia gets a pardon, number 2, they get funding from the government, number 3, they get weapons, number 4, they get access to satellite cameras, and finally, number 5, they get information on Nia's movements with the SPK. On the phone, the president does agree to all of this since he doesn't want to be killed, but immediately afterwards he calls up Light for help. Working together, Light and the president organize a team of 30 men to attack Mello's base and get the notebook back, and I should also mention that just like the anime, Misa uses her eyes to manipulate Kal Snyder into sending them Mello's address. The 30 soldiers then arrive at Mello's base to, carry out their mission. However, by this point, Sido has entered the equation. Like I said before, the notebook that the Mafia has originally belonged to Sido, and so he came back down to Earth to literally get it back because otherwise he's gonna die pretty soon. He needs to start killing humans to gain more life. The reality is though, he didn't really have a plan for how he was gonna get it back from the humans, and so for a while he was just doing whatever Mello and the gang told him to do. What this meant is that number one, they told him to stand guard of their base, and so when the soldiers swooped in, Sido made a move and basically removed each of their helmets one by one. This then exposed their faces to the CCTV cameras, and it just so happens that in a completely separate room, Mello, Kal Snyder, and Dwight Gordon, they were all watching these events unfold. By this point, Dwight had literally forced Kal Snyder at gunpoint to make the eye deal with Sido, and so because of that, Kal was able to see their names. However, the group clearly didn't trust Kal, which is why he's handcuffed in this panel, although it's possible he's handcuffed because they found out that he sent the letter of the address to Misa, although this isn't confirmed either way. Regardless, the fact is that Kal has the Shinigami eyes, and so he reads out the names of all the 30 soldiers while Dwight writes their names in the notebook. The gang then leave the area and escape to a different location, and after finding out that the plan failed, the president commits suicide because he's afraid of what Mello might do. As a side note, it's also heavily implied that Light was the one who made him do this by using the notebook, and I guess one reason he would have done this was so that the president couldn't be manipulated by Mello in the future. Overall, for the way they used the Death Note, I'm going to give the Mafia a 3 out of 5 collectively, but let's just quickly break it down on an individual level. So when it comes to Y462, he personally gets a 2 out of 5, and the reason for this is that, his goal for using the Death Note, he wanted to essentially wipe the slate clean. Apparently he had done some bad things in the past, and so the boss was angry at him, and so he thought that by doing this, it would make up for his past mistakes. So what we know for sure is that he didn't make up for those mistakes, given that the boss killed him anyway, and so that's one of the reasons why he gets such a low rating. However, the reason he does still get a 2, at least, he does still get something, is because he used the notebook in a way that was useful to the Mafia. The reason we know this is because number one, he proved to them that the notebook was real by testing it out, and number two, he erased all traces of their crime of stealing the notebook, because in the manga, he killed the pilot of the airplane, who was someone who was working for them, and he also killed the other guy who made Light's dad go on the plane. So those were the two people that could possibly be investigated by the police, and he killed both of them, so there was no way for them to track down Mello and the gang. Moving on to Kal Snyder, he gets a 2.5 out of 5, given that he was even more useful because he had the Shinigami eyes. If it wasn't for him, they never would have survived the first raid. However, Kal does have many drawbacks, the first being that he was the one who gave away their location in the first place. Because of that, it's hard to work out if Kal was an asset or a liability, because he was helping the Mafia, but at the same time, he was also seriously hurting them as well. There's also the fact that when he made the eye deal, Dwight promised him that he'd become the right-hand man of the Mafia, and that clearly wasn't the case. They didn't trust him, they had him handcuffed, so he was lied to and basically just used. Speaking of Dwight, he's the one who physically used the notebook to get rid of the 30 soldiers, and the authors of Death Note described him as the most evil character in the story. I decided to give him a 3 out of 5 because he was very efficient when it came to using the notebook, in that he forced other people to make the eye deal on his behalf. Lastly, Mello also gets a 3 out of 5, and this was disappointing because he had potential for a 5 out of 5. Like, his plan was perfect, the way he got the Death Note, it was amazing. Not to mention that if his threat to the president had worked and if he had gotten all of those demands, yeah, that definitely would have been a 5 out of 5. But the fact is, he was betrayed by Sido, he was outsmarted by Kira twice and forced to flee his base without the notebook, he had to blow up his face in the process, and also his threat to the president didn't work. Like, the second they finished their phone call, the president was on the phone to Light. So even though Mello had good ideas, nothing worked in the end when it came to this specifically. And so yeah, for that reason, I have to give him a 3 out of 5, but I wish I could have given him more. Anyhow, moving away from the Mafia and back to the Japanese police, there's one character here who had full ownership of the notebook for a short period of time, and I honestly had no idea about this. Like, I watched the anime, I never really read the manga for Death Note until I made this video, and so when rereading it, you find out that in chapter 72, Hideki Ide did have temporary possession of the notebook. To be specific, the notebook that Ide had was the one that was given to them by Kira in the post, and the reason they chose Ide to have ownership was actually kind of genius. For a bit of context, Kira had sent the Japanese police the notebook because he wanted them to use it in order to get the other one back from Mello. And so in this moment, Light's dad was the one who volunteered to take ownership and make this Shinigami eye deal as well. However, Ide points out that it's possible that because the director is so well known, If he takes ownership of the notebook, then someone on Mello's team, like for example Kal Snyder, if they see a picture of Light's dad, then they'll know he owns a Death Note. The reason for this is that if someone owns a notebook, you can't see their lifespan above their heads if you have the Shinigami eyes. And so yeah, Ide was just warning everyone that if Mello's team has someone like that, then it's possible, if not likely, that they'd find out that Light's dad has a Death Note before the raid happens. For obvious reasons, that could be a security risk, since they might just end up killing Light's dad before the raid even happens. And so yeah, for that reason, Light decides that Ide should be the one to take ownership, since in his words, Ide is least likely to be known by Mello. In terms of a rating, I feel like it would be rude for me to give him one, just because he didn't do a single thing with it except take ownership. But if I had to give him one, 5 out of 5, just because he did do what he was supposed to do, and by taking ownership, he did kind of protect the director. So yeah, 5 out of 5, I suppose. Probably the least deserved 5 out of 5 in history. Up next is of course Soichiro Yagami, and in terms of the pros and cons, he does actually have quite a few pros to his name, the first being that he was the one who found out Mello's real identity. Thanks to his Shinigami eyes, he was able to see and tell everyone else that Mello's real name was Mihail Kale, and that information was incredibly helpful to Light later on when his underlings were able to use it to kill Mello once and for all. Additionally, it was him who volunteered to make the Shinigami ideal in the first place, even though Matsuda wanted to do it, and I guess you could say that was him being noble like he always is, as definitely out of all the characters, he was the one with the strongest moral compass. On a similar note, it's very relevant that because of his strong will, he refused to let go of the Death Note under any circumstances, because when Mello and the gang had basically attacked him and he was in a very vulnerable position, even then he still wouldn't let it go. He just was so determined to make up for his mistake of giving it to them in the first place. That being said, a large factor in all of these ratings I've done is basically how useful was the Death Note to the person who was using it, and did they use it in a way that, benefited them a lot. And when it comes to Light's dad, I would say 100% yes, because due to his ownership of the Death Note and the Shinigami eyes, he finally confirmed to himself that Light wasn't Kira. Up until that point, Light was one of the biggest suspects there was in the Kira investigation, and it must have been playing in the back of his mind the entire time about whether his son could actually be the mass murderer that he'd been investigating for all this time. It was thanks to him gaining the Death Note and these Shinigami eyes that he was able to finally confirm once and for all that his son was innocent, because when he looked at Light, he saw that above Light's head he could see his lifespan. By default, that meant that Light didn't own a Death Note, even though he did actually have one on him in this moment, but the fact is he didn't own a Death Note, and so from his dad's perspective, this meant that Light was 100% innocent all along. Ryuk even goes on to say that most people who use the Death Note are cursed with misfortune, but in the case of Light's dad, he died believing that his son wasn't Kira, so in a way he was the first person to use this thing who actually died happy. For that specific reason, I'm giving Light's dad a 5 out of 5, and this time it's a real 5 out of 5, because ultimately the notebook was able to give him the one thing he wanted more than anything else in the world. Now, we're finally down to the last two characters, and those are Teru Mikami and Kiyomi Takada, who are two of Light's loyalist followers and two people who acted as Kira at a time when Light literally just wasn't able to do it himself. In terms of the good things we can say about them, for the most part, when it comes to Mikami, he did think on the same wavelength as Light, and he took actions that Light likely would have taken himself, for example, when he killed Demigawa. On top of that, Mikami also had great deductive reasoning, which is why he was able to work out that Light couldn't move freely, and he also worked out when Light was in the room. He just, for the most part, he was pretty intelligent and was able to fill in the gaps when information was lacking. Takada was similar in that she was very intelligent and shared the same morals as Kira and Light, although there were some occasions when both Mikami and Takada strayed from what Light believed, and sometimes they would take things too far, like when they put out the idea that maybe innocent people would now be punished by Kira if they were too lazy, for example. Like, they did push the boundaries a little bit, but for the most part, they all thought in the same way. One of the interesting things about Takada especially is that she had never, I'm assuming, had never even thought about killing someone before. But when Light gave her the responsibility of being Kira and killing criminals, she didn't really hesitate. Like, at first she was shocked, But it's not like she ever said to him, I don't want to do this, or I'm not going to do this. She pretty much started doing it straight away, which proves, I guess, her loyalty to Light, her loyalty to Kira, and he couldn't really ask for anything more than what she did. Like, she ticked all the boxes down until the very end. Even when she was in this terrible situation, she was still going to follow his instructions and kill criminals and kill Mello. She was definitely one of the most loyal people he had. Because of everything we saw, I would personally give Takada a 4 out of 5 when it came to using the Death Note. Like, she didn't make any mistakes. However, the same cannot be said for Mikami. Even though he was clearly an intelligent person, the fact remains that his mistake is ultimately what got Light killed. And that mistake is that he had a schedule that was so precise that if he ever deviated from that schedule, everybody would know that something was wrong. I feel like if Mikami had acted like a normal person the whole time and wasn't so rigid with his schedule, then people wouldn't notice certain things. But it's the fact that every day he did the exact same things in the exact same order, when he eventually deviated from that, that is what gave the game away. To be specific, during the climax of the story, Mikami knew that he was being watched by Nier and the SPK, and on top of that, he also had strict instructions not to do anything until the final showdown. Regardless, when Takada was taken hostage, Mikami made his biggest mistake, and he diverged from his normal schedule to go to the bank where he wrote her name in the real Death Note. Up until then, he'd been using a fake Death Note because he knew he was being watched, which is the crazy thing. He knew he was being watched, but he still went to the bank and showed them where the real Death Note was, so that was just dumb. He also didn't test the Death Note before the final showdown, which was so stupid, because Mikami knew that the SPK had tried to trick him already. Like, there was already one Death Note, fake Death Note that he was using, that got swapped out for another fake Death Note. So he knew that someone was watching him, and he knew that they were willing to replace his Death Note with a fake. So at least it makes sense to just try one more time before the final showdown to make sure that the Death Note you have is definitely real. And he didn't do that, and that's ultimately why he lost, and it's why Light lost. So when we remember that the whole reason Light gave him the Death Note was because he was so intelligent and wouldn't make mistakes like this, you can only say that Mikami's time as the Death Note user ultimately ended in failure. And so for that reason, I'm giving him a 2 out of 5. The errors were just way too fatal to forgive that. I will say though that in the manga, it was mentioned by Matsuda that during the final showdown, it's possible that Mikami wasn't in control of his actions because Nier was controlling him with the Death Note. Now, this was just a theory of Matsuda, but obviously it was written, the author of Death Note wrote this for a reason, kind of putting it out there. So it's possible that the mistakes Mikami made were not down to him. It was because he was being controlled by Nier. And if that was the case, in that scenario, I would give Mikami a rating of 4 out of 5, because up until the moment he was being controlled, if he was being controlled, he was perfect pretty much. He did everything he needed to do. But this is a theory at this point. We don't actually know if Nier really did use the Death Note or not to control Mikami. But it is interesting that in the manga, Mikami was arrested, and then 10 days later he died in mysterious circumstances, and nobody knows why. And then the Death Notes were of course burnt by Nier, so if Nier did write his name down, no one would ever know. So it's interesting. Do you think Nier cheated and used the Death Note? Because if he did, then technically that makes him a Death Note user. And if he did in fact do what this theory is saying, then I would give Nier a 5 out of 5, because simply put, he won the game. He beat Light by using the Death Note against him. And not only that, he covered his tracks perfectly as well. Anyway people, I hope you enjoyed this list of every Death Note user, and before we end the video, I'd like you to do 2 things. Number 1, I'd appreciate if you liked, subscribed, as this video took ages to make, so I'd really appreciate it if you've watched all this way, if you could just like and subscribe, and maybe share it as well if you're feeling generous. And another thing, I want you to check out the Death Note musical album that's coming out very soon, and the reason I say that is because earlier this year in 2023, there was the Death Note musical in London, and I had no idea about this, but my friend mentioned it to me, and so we ended up going, and it was just so good. And I have to say, the album is coming out this year, and I'm just mentioning it because I know some people might not even know that it's a thing, because I definitely didn't know it was a thing. So yeah, just check it out if you haven't heard of it before. Thank you guys for watching as always, and until the next one, peace out.